everyone. This is Talk Back. It is December 21st, 2020, the end of one of the most important years in American history besides the pandemic. We have our cataclysmic electoral issues, and we have somebody today who's going to help us understand and give us perspective on the politics of what's happening today and the history. I want to introduce my guest for today, Professor Douglas M. Spencer. Hi, Professor. Good to see you.
Hi, Sheila. Thank you.
Okay, it's great to have you here. You're a professor at UConn, but you are our visiting professor in Colorado now. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, at the University of Colorado.
And I want to read some of your qualifications because you have a very extensive and wonderful resume. I want everybody to know what you've done. You have a PhD in jurisprudence and social policy from the University of California at Berkeley, a JD, Juris Doctor, law degree from Berkeley Law, an MPP from UC Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy, and a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Columbia University. Are you still in school or are you done?
My kids asked me the same question, but I finally have a real job.
Okay, great. So now I want to read about your profession. You're a professor with appointments in both the law school and the Department of Public Policy. Your research interests include studying public law, campaign finance, voting rights, and election administration. You teach constitutional law, election law, and public policy at the programs at UConn. Professor, you've written many articles, you've written books on the issues of election and voting rights. Did I leave anything out? Are you writing another book on dance or art or something?
No, I'm just trying to enjoy myself right now.
Okay. So one of the things that you and I talked about before we began is how this political season has really helped us with civic education in this country. One of the things that I regret is how so many of our citizens don't vote enough, how many of them don't really understand our history, understand our democracy, don't understand the Electoral College. But maybe this particular political season and all the issues it's brought up has given us education. What do you think about that? Do you think there's some truth to that?
I think there's a lot of truth to that, actually. I think civic education has been a problem in the United States for a long time. But I also think there's a large group of individuals who had written off politics as a way for them to air grievances, to find solutions to their problems. And one of the things that I have found fascinating ever since the 2016 election is this new cadre of voters that have come out of the woodworks and decided that they do want to engage on some of these important issues about how we run our society through the political sphere, as opposed to other ways that we may go about this. I think the benefit of doing that is if you feel that something's wrong in your life and you feel like one of the solutions to that is to elect people who represent your interests and then can change society to implement those changes, you'll go about behaving in a peaceful manner. You can use politics and the law to enact changes without resorting to violence. So I see that as an actual benefit of the way that politics has developed over the last 4 or 5 years. Even though the politics themselves have been very toxic, I think that it has given an outlet for a lot of individuals to figure out ways to think about the way they want their society organized and then to engage to make that happen.
Right. So we did have better voter participation than ever before. We still have millions of Americans who don't even register to vote, but those that did register to vote in my town in Connecticut, in Colchester, we had about 93% participation, which was absolutely fantastic. And I think around the country, we had that as well. So I guess the question is this a function of Donald Trump and as you said, some of the toxic issues that his administration and his personality has brought about? And do you think that will last? Will that last? Or if we ever get back to, quote, normal, whatever that is, we will not have the same kind of participation and interest. What do you think of that?
I think we're not going to see such high participation rates again for quite a long time. Political scientists and lawyers have complained about low participation rates for a long time. But there's low participation rates in politics for a number of reasons. One is if you don't engage people or you actively try to suppress voters, and that's really been on people's minds a lot lately. But another reason people may not show up to vote is if it's just not an important issue for them. They don't see that the election really matters. Either their life is just fine. So why go through all the trouble of voting when it doesn't really matter? You're going to be just fine either way. And I think what happened in this last election is that people were convinced that things weren't okay. I think the pandemic contributed to that. I think the racial strife after the murder of George Floyd has contributed to that. Unemployment has contributed to that. So I think there was a sense that life wasn't okay, and that this election did provide an actual pivot that would change the way that things went going forward. And that drew people to the polls. And that's heartening, because I think what that means is a few things. One, maybe the depressed turnout that we've seen before can't be contributed to active voter suppression efforts to the degree that people have complained. Maybe some of it was just that people were choosing not to come because the election didn't seem to matter to them. That's part of it. But I don't think that we will see such a strong pivotal moment in 2024 or 2028. And so I think that we'll see participation rates move back from the 80% and into the 70 and 60%.
Right. Of course, we're talking about national participation, but where the rubber meets the road and where most of the things in life, your street lights, your electricity, your services, your culture, a lot of that comes in the local level. And we still have such a low participation when it comes to our local elections, our mayors, our selectmen in the various towns and communities. I find that interesting too, because isn't that the most important place where your services are and where voting really matters?
100%. It is a strange paradox that people turn out to vote at a very, very high rate for members of Congress and for the president. And we vote for them based on conversations about issues that they probably won't even ever vote on, that may never come up. We may not have a bill that comes up about women's reproductive rights, for example, but that's going to drive a conversation. But we will change the curriculum in our schools and have traffic laws change if people are dying at an intersection. And those elections really matter that are local. You know, I moved to Connecticut in 2013, and the very first election that happened when I moved was a school board election in Hartford, and turnout was 4%. It still just shocks the mind. And I know I don't live in Hartford, but I know there are complaints about the Hartford education system. And that was a moment for people to take matters into their own hands. And 4% of people turned out to vote. It really undermines the legitimacy of what happens after that. But it's also on us to recognize if we're not turning out, then we're going to get what we deserve, what we pay for.
Right. I don't want to necessarily get political, but I put a lot of that onto the Ronald Reagan administration. When he came in, I think it was in his inaugural address, he said that government is not the solution, it's the problem. I mean, why do you want to become the president of an organization where you say is a big problem that nobody should pay attention to, right? I think that led to, over these last 40 years since Reagan, a feeling that government is an obstacle, is a problem, and isn't something that we should support, and politicians aren't valuable, honorable servants. Do you agree with any of that thinking?
I do. I think that there's always an interesting paradox in public service and public life. I work at a public university. My wife works at a public university. I was educated at public universities, and I've seen this firsthand. We complain that the government is so inept and unable to do the functions that we want it to do, but we refuse to give government the resources to do the jobs that it will do. So you may take, for example, the healthcare law that was passed, the Obamacare law. Well, we haven't funded that law, and so now we complain that it's not functioning the way that it's supposed to, but we never gave it a chance to function the way it's supposed to. And that's just an example. It happens all the time. Our universities aren't functioning as healthy as they should be, but we're not giving them the resources to. And then when they don't, we're complaining about it. And I think some of that could be this ethos that was articulated by Reagan in his inaugural address. You know, the 7 words you don't want to hear is, "Hi, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you." That was part of his inaugural address. But I do think over time, the Republican Party, maybe more so because of their desire to starve the government of resources and shrink the tax base. But I do think that it's always going to be a tension within public institutions, that we want them to function on as low money as possible because we don't want to pay any taxes. But then we have to recognize that the services will be provided. We have to be realistic about what that will be. And I think that our expectations have not matched the delivery. And that's, you know, a breakdown across the board.
Right. And then we have a tension where we go back and forth in our elections between the Democrats and the Republicans. So the Democrats come in and they want to provide services, and maybe we need some more revenue. And then the Republicans come in and they want to cut back. And I think that the Republicans are having a tantrum since the 1930s. They've never gotten over Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, and they've been trying to dismantle it ever since. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't know. I can say my dad was a very staunch Republican, and he railed against New Deal programs, but he also is one of these seniors. He's not with us anymore, unfortunately, but he was one of these seniors who was attached to his Social Security check like nobody's business and wouldn't want the government to touch his Social Security check. And so, and again, I think this goes back to the matter of civic education. I think people need to recognize what's happened and why. They need to recognize how things have developed and the proper way to go about changing them if they don't think so. I also think Democrats have been in a little bit of a tantrum since Reagan for exactly the reasons that you articulate. And so that's a robust debate that's been going on because there's been some flashpoints of high moments for Republicans in the 80s, I would say, and high moments for Democrats in the 60s with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and in the 30s with the New Deal. And the other party has been, it's been hard to swallow. Obamacare has been the law now for 10 years. And we're still acting like, well, we'll just overturn it. It's a new thing. We don't have to really let it go into effect. At some point, it becomes part of our fabric, and we need to move on to other debates.
Right. All right. So let's get back to an overview that I want our viewers to see before we get to the nitty gritty of what's happening now. So the Electoral College met last week in the various states, and that was interesting. I watched that on television. And you and I were talking about 4 years ago, each of us was at the Senate chambers of the Connecticut State House, where we watched the Electoral College in action then. And now on January 6th, the Electoral College votes are going to be reviewed and certified by the Senate, with the vice president sitting as the president of the Senate. So let's go back in history. What is the Electoral College? And Americans think that we have 100% democracy in this country, one man, one vote, but we don't have that. Explain.
Well, we have that for a lot of elections in our country, but we don't have a one person, one vote, pure democratic system for selecting our executive leader, the president. And that stems from a lot of decisions that were made by the founding fathers trying to decide if we wanted a parliamentary election, where essentially the Speaker of the House was chosen by members of Congress and then functioned as the chief executive, which exists in many countries in Europe. We didn't want a king, so we had this hybrid where we would elect a unique person separate from the legislative branch, but we also were worried about having the masses elect a leader, both because the masses can be whipped up into a frenzy, which, look at the last month, there's some truth to that. And also, of course, racism and the desire to mute the voices of slaves and political power in certain parts of the country. That's a big part of the Electoral College as well. It's rooted in that desire to mute the power of the southern states, and particularly the voices of African Americans, who at the time were not Americans, they were Africans. We had not granted them any kind of citizenship status. The way that the Electoral College was defended by Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers was that the Electoral College would be filled with men who were intelligent and educated and dispassionate and unable to be whipped up into a frenzy by rhetoric and unable to be bribed, because they would pop up at the last minute. You wouldn't know who they were in advance. They would be difficult to coordinate because they would exist in all of the 13 states. And then they would sit down and elect who they thought among the people who were running for president deserved to hold that high office. And it would be done in a very thoughtful way. That was the idea, at least as it was sold after the fact. And now here we are 200 some odd years later. And by and large, the Electoral College outcome mimics the outcome of our elections almost every time, to the extent that people may not even realize we have an Electoral College and they think that we're living in a true democracy. But when it comes to president, it turns out there are a few occasions where the person who wins the popular vote doesn't win the Electoral College vote. That's okay to the extent that that's been the rule, and it was the rule in advance of the election. But now there are calls to change that because it feels like it's undermining the democratic strength of our nation.
Okay, so I want you to explain how, with the Electoral College, each state gets the number of electors of the number of senators and Congress people, and why there's such an imbalance now. If you're a Californian, why does your vote seem to count so much less? Your 55 electoral votes represents how many millions of people, whereas Wyoming's 3 electoral votes represents they have more power in voting. Explain that.
Well, that wasn't intended, of course, for the Electoral College to be so skewed. But that's driven by 2 things. One, the Senate is an institution that guarantees 2 members for every state, regardless of its size. And many people don't realize that that cannot be amended. Explicitly in Section 5 of the U.S. Constitution, which provides the mechanism for us to amend the Constitution, it explicitly says at the end, oh, but by the way, you can't amend the Constitution to change representation in the Senate. So the only way that we would ever change Senate representation is through scrapping a Constitution and writing a new one altogether, which is a pretty drastic move. The other reason is that every state is guaranteed at least 1 member of Congress. So right now, the average district size for a member of Congress is about 690,000 people. But there are some states that don't even have that population. And so they're guaranteed a representative and 2 senators. These are a lot of the big square states in the middle of our country. I was born and raised in one of them. And that turns out to provide a lot of extra power in the Electoral College, but also a lot of extra power in the legislative branch as well, in terms of what bills get discussed and what bills get passed. The reason, and this goes back to kind of elementary understanding of the founding, was a compromise between the power of large states and small states to give small states equal footing in one branch of our legislative government, and then to give larger states power in the House of Representatives by allocating representatives by population. The Electoral College was seen as, well, let's get all of those individuals together to decide our president, or at least the number. And that now, as our population inequality has grown, California's gotten nearly 40 million people and Wyoming's less than 1 million. That creates huge disparities in who has power to select the president.
Right. That's what I was going to ask you. Do you think the founders could have ever contemplated the explosion in population in some of the states that would make even their concept of the Electoral College so skewed? And do you think they didn't set in place a mechanism to change that? What do you think about that?
I think they would be shocked at how big our country has become. Right. You know, the country's population and its founding was very, very small. And the fact that we've expanded westward so far and then brought in hundreds of millions of people, and the hundreds of millions of people haven't dispersed equally. Now, part of that's natural resources and access to water and other things, but there hasn't been, you know, I think the disparity between the largest and the smallest state at the founding was something like 12-1. And now the disparity is 50-1.
Yeah.
And, you know, I do think that if the founding fathers were around and writing a constitution today, they wouldn't have granted the Senate that much of an unequal playing field. But we have the Constitution that we have, and we have to operate. And as I said, even still, given this huge disparity, but for 3 or 4 elections over 240 years, the person who won the Electoral College vote also won the support of the population. And I should qualify that because for a long time, actually, the electors met and they chose whoever the state legislature told them to select. It's only in modern times, since the mid-1900s, that state legislature said, you know what? We're not going to basically tell the electors how to vote. We're going to hold an election in our state, and we'll tell our electors to vote however the people voted in that election. But that hasn't always been the case. For more of our history, there weren't popular elections for president. And so even though it feels undemocratic now, we're living in one of the most democratic times of the entire history of our country.
So when we vote for Biden or Trump, we're not voting for Biden or Trump. We're voting for, in Connecticut, the 7 electors who are going to be the ones to choose the president. Isn't that right?
That's right. And there's some debate about what appears on the ballot. In some states, the name Joe Biden and Donald Trump appears. In some states, there's a little fine print that says the electors for Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And in some states, they actually list the electors, and you vote for the slate of electors, recognizing who they represent. And that's just a different approach.
But in the Constitution, as you were describing it, the electors were able to choose whoever they wanted, regardless of whether there was a vote of the people or not. And so explain that. I know in some states, they've passed legislation where the electors must, by law, vote for who the popular vote winner was in their state. And in other states, electors can be free to vote for anybody. Is that true?
Well, Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution says that the electors are chosen in the manner by each state, in the manner that's dictated by the legislature. So the electors don't get to vote however they want. They vote under the direction of the state legislatures. And the state legislatures have decided that they want their electors to vote based on the popular vote's outcome. Now, that could change. If the Connecticut state legislature said, you know what, we want to take power back into our hands, they could pass a law. It would be a simple state statute that says, going forward, electors to choose the president will vote according to fill in the blank. According to how we want them to vote, we will pass a resolution that says we want you to cast your votes for X, Y, or Z. It could be, we will give you full authority to vote however you want. It could be, you should vote in accordance with who won the national popular vote. Who cares who won our state? Look nationally. The state legislature gets to make that determination. Right. And that is still a possibility in any state in the country.
Right. And the Supreme Court took on a case this year talking about the faithless electors, someone who in the Trump election, where he was actually got 306 electoral votes, but 2 people did not vote for him, and those were what they call faithless electors. The Supreme Court said the state could decide that they were mandated to vote for whoever won the popular vote, right?
That's correct. So the second question is, what happens if a state legislature directs the electors to vote in a certain way, however they've decided, and the electors go rogue? And some states have penalties and say, oh, you voted against the way that your state that we told you to, you'll be fined $1,000, you'll go to jail, or we will replace you with somebody else. And an elector who went rogue filed a lawsuit and said, a state legislature can't punish me. I was elected in the manner they chose, and I get to now vote my conscience. And they were citing language from Alexander Hamilton originally that said, we're doing this in a very thoughtful way, and I have full authority to do that. And the Supreme Court said, no. The Constitution said the state legislature gets to decide. And if you deviate from their course of action and they punish you, that's acceptable.
Okay. So now Americans say, we're a democracy. This is ridiculous. Whoever, Hillary Clinton won by 3 million more popular votes. Biden won by 7 million more. But just a little turning of votes in some of the battleground states, we could have had another election like 2016. And so somebody says, let's get rid of the Electoral College. So, Professor, you talked about that a little bit. Discuss that. How hard is it to have a constitutional convention, or the other ways of amending the Constitution? There are several ways you can go about it. Will that ever happen?
I don't know how to predict the future, but I can tell you it's extraordinarily difficult. We've only amended our Constitution 27 times. And for something that is this consequential, it will be difficult in part because you need 3/5 of the states to ratify any change that's made to the Constitution, which means that 2/5 of the states can veto any changes, and 2/5 of the states benefit from the current situation. The middle states in the country would largely be ignored. The Ohios, the Kansas, the Iowa caucuses, maybe even the New Hampshire primaries. These states that don't have a large population would start to lose their power in the selection process, and they're unlikely to vote for a change in the way that the system works. And so it'd be very difficult. There's trade-offs in having a change to the Electoral College. Right now, we believe that each state has something unique and special about them, and the state has some sovereignty to act on its own. And in fact, liberals have been finding hope in states' rights in a way that they've been deriding states' rights for the last 50 years. Many liberal states have found ways through their own state operations to kick back against Trump administration policies they don't like. And in previous years, states, Texas, for example, tried to not expand their Medicaid offerings under the Obamacare law because they were trying to push back against a federal government they didn't like. That's a part of the American story. And if we do believe that states have some special standing, then there is some legitimacy to giving each state some say in how the president is chosen. That's the way that the current Electoral College works. It's this understanding that we believe in states in some way. The alternative is, if we go to a fully national popular vote, what this would ultimately do is empower political minorities everywhere across the country. Now, Republicans in Connecticut, who are unlikely to elect the Electoral College votes in their state, should come out to vote, because now their votes matter for choosing the government. Republicans in California, Democrats in Texas. If we got rid of the Electoral College, what we would be doing is empowering the political minority groups to have a voice and to really take into account, but at the expense of the state institution. And that's really the debate that's going on. I don't see that the Constitution will be amended to explicitly eliminate the Electoral College. I see states finding other ways around it. For example, Connecticut state legislature passed a law that said if enough legislatures around the country pass the same law, we will start to allocate our electors based on who won the national popular vote.
Right.
So if a Republican wins the national popular vote, but a Democrat wins Connecticut, Connecticut has committed to giving its electors to the Republican candidate going forward.
And once enough states enact that measure, and there are 270 electoral votes from those states, that could happen. But is that constitutional? I'm sure that would be disputed in the courts, wouldn't it?
Oh, there would be huge disputes, and there have already been some disputes about it. I think it's an open question whether it would be legal. I personally think that the legal challenges are surmountable. I think that it would survive a legal challenge, but I do think that there are some practical considerations, because it's not clear, for example, what would happen in a really close election. What if a state decided to change its law at the last second and not follow through on its agreement? How is one state legislature going to hold another state legislature accountable? So in practice, I see that national popular vote interstate compact has some challenges ahead of it on the practical side. I do think legally it holds promise and is likely to survive a legal challenge.
Okay. And you just hear from some people who were frustrated, Democrats who think of 2000 and then, of course, 2016, when Democrats won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. They say, let's just have secession. Let's have the blues secede and the Reds they're on their own. That's not going to happen in this country, is it? We're not.
No, I don't think that's going to. I don't think that's going to happen. That would be. It's happened before, so you can't rule anything out. But there's a couple of differences. Before, opposition to the federal government was concentrated in a few neighboring states in the Deep South. They're able to make a natural boundary. Now you have red and blue states kind of checkering the country. What are you going to do with Colorado that's surrounded by red states? Is it going to be part of the blue coalition, but to drive to another part of its country, you've got to drive through another country? It's just not going to happen practically. And there's no mechanism. There's no legal mechanism in the Constitution for secession. The best that people can hope for is that we call a constitutional convention and create a new document that people agree on.
Okay. So now we had the Electoral College vote last week, and now on January 6th, we're going to have the proceeding to, I guess, certify it and make it 100% official. So I want you to go back in history and tell us, because I remember in 1876 was the first time, I don't know, was it the first time, but there was the Tilden-Hayes dispute. Talk about that a little bit and how that led to a resolution that gave the presidency to Hayes when he did not get the popular vote.
Yeah. The Tilden-Hayes election is a really interesting precursor to what we're facing today. And it gives us some lessons that we should take away about how messy things can be. One of the important things to understand is that the election wasn't decided in courts. So even there was a major dispute, essentially there were some allegations of fraud in certain parts of the country. And so some states weren't exactly sure who had won their own state. And the state legislature said, well, this is who we think won our state. And the governor said, well, we think somebody else won the state. And they sent competing electors to Congress. And then Congress had to decide, well, which electors are we going to accept? And the voting for making that determination is by state. It's not by representative. So the state delegations get together And so all of the Connecticut delegation gets together and they get to cast one vote. And those votes ended up in a tie. And this actually wasn't the first time that happened either. For the true history buffs, you go back to the election of 1800, and we had Jefferson and Adams were tied, and Alexander Hamilton threw his hat, Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson were tied, and there were tied ballots in the House 30 times. So this repeated itself 76 years later, and ultimately a commission was formed that was made up of members of Congress and a judge, and a deal was struck. Essentially, the southern states said, we will go along in giving the election to Rutherford B. Hayes, who hadn't won the popular vote, in exchange for, this was 1876, so it's after the Civil War, and after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which guaranteed equality for African Americans, abolished slavery, gave them equal voting rights and equality under the law. And they said, as long as the federal government won't enforce those new Reconstruction amendments against us, we will go along and vote for Rutherford B. Hayes. And it was this deal with the devil that ultimately put in the winner who hadn't won the popular vote in exchange for the federal government leaving the southern states alone, allowing them to suppress the vote for another 100 years before the Voting Rights Act.
Right. That ushered in the whole Jim Crow era, right?
That's correct.
But as a result of that kerfuffle or boondoggle or whatever you want to call it, a statute was passed some years later that is very long and it's hard to read, even for a lawyer, and talks about what happens on January 6th and the Electoral College and goes into it. How does that statute going to have a bearing on what's going to happen on January 6th coming up?
Yeah, the Electoral Count Act of 1887 was passed by Congress specifically to prevent any kind of disaster from happening again, like what happened in the Tilden Hayes election of 1876. And it's long and arcane, it's really old. But essentially, it says a few things. One, the state legislature gets to decide who the electors are, which is just a restatement of Article 2 of the Constitution. And then it provides some actual practical guidance for what this should look like. And the most important part says that once Congress gets the slate of electors from those states, Congress is bound to accept whatever the states send to them. The concern was that Congress might take those slates of electors and then start challenging them or doubting them in some way. And they said, so long as the states send their electors or announce their electors with 6 days before the Electoral College meets, then those electors must be the electors that Congress is bound to follow. Congress tied its own hands. It said we cannot challenge those electors so long as they were selected. It's been called the safe harbor date because what happens is as long as a state identifies their electors 6 days before the Electoral College, then there's a safe harbor that those will count in Congress. And that's the most important part of the Electoral Count Act of 1887 that still exists. It's in Title III of the United States Code in Section 5, for those who want to go and Google and read the actual text about it. And that will come into play on January 6th, because every state, I believe, except Hawaii, which turned in its electors a little bit late for some certification reasons, but isn't up for dispute. And these are the states that have really mattered: Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, these 5 or 6 states that Trump has really been focused on. Each one of those states certified their votes before 6 days prior to the Electoral College meeting. So no matter what we hear talked about in the news, Congress is bound by law to accept those electors.
Okay, so because the safe harbor date was met and the Electoral College is met, you're saying that all the states that had their Electoral College votes, when they go into Congress, Congress really cannot contest that. So why are we hearing from Trump and Trump's people that Representative Mo Brooks of Alabama, for one, and maybe the new senator from Alabama, Tuberville, or whatever his name is, are going to go in on January 6th and going to jointly dispute the electoral votes from various states? Explain why they can still try to do that and what might happen.
Well, the reason they're doing that is because they either don't understand or don't care about or respect the law. That's the bottom line. And I think that they do understand the law. Tommy Tuberville's never been a senator. He's an old football coach, but he understands what the Electoral Count Act says because he's been in the press talking about it. Why are they doing this? Well, they're doing this for political reasons. They're not doing it for legal reasons. It's not going to work. If a member of Congress and a member of the Senate raise an objection, then by the rule, the Electoral Count Act says, well, if there are objections, then the House meets and the Senate meets, and both of them have to vote with a majority to decide to throw out a state. So one, they would have to decide to overturn their own law after the fact, but it's never going to happen politically. Legally it can't happen, but even politically it won't happen because Democrats control the House, so they're not going to vote for it. But even in the Senate, there's already been enough senators saying we would never vote for this to overturn the will of the election. Even the Senate wouldn't be able to muster a majority. So the only reason to do that is one, to raise the national profile. People had never heard of Mo Brooks before. Now he's on everyone's mind. He's raised his national profile. Donald Trump is somebody who just fights, doesn't care about the law, and wants to create a spectacle and be on TV. So these will be dismissed very quickly. They'll stand up the microphone and say, I challenge the law. And then there'll be a question. Well, is there a senator who joins you? And the answer is probably no, because Mitch McConnell has put strong-arming Republicans not to do this. But let's say a senator does. Then they'll say, okay, let's retreat to our respective houses and have a vote. And they may dispense with that by saying, let's just have a vote right here by voice. And everyone will shout nay. And then they'll move on. It'll be a television spectacle with no bite.
Okay, so I understand that now. But, Professor, you see the unbelievable hold that someone like Trump has on the Republican Party. How many Republicans are not even recognizing Biden's election or don't dare to because they might get a bad tweet or harm their electoral chances in the future. So what if you had somebody like Trump, but even more strategic, smarter? Trump is not very bright. He's transactional and impulsive. What if you had somebody really smart? And what if the Republicans control not just the Senate, but the House of Representatives as well? And they were all beholden under the spell of this Trump-like candidate. Could it happen? You said theoretically it could. And so I guess I'm saying, how far to the bounds of what is right can we go in this country? Take my assumptions. The House is all Republican, the Senate, and they are under the spell of a Trump-like leader, only stronger and more powerful.
Well, this is a concern. The concern, I think, is what's been called an auto gulp. This is a person who rises to power by legal means and then tries to stay in power by illegal means. And we've seen this happen actually around the world in recent years. This is why it's been on people's radar, that authoritarianism is on the rise, and not coups, not militaries coming and throwing over countries, people elected, but then they go about changing the laws and changing the courts, or ignoring the laws and ignoring the courts in a way to stay in power. And somebody who was had more facility with public service. This was always Donald Trump's challenge. He came from the private sector, and he doesn't understand how to work within the bureaucracy. Somebody else, as you point out, may be very well versed in parliamentary procedure and the courts and the right ways to make arguments in order to facilitate a kind of a self-coup like this. It is a big concern. I do think it could happen. And I don't know what to say about that. I think we have to be vigilant as voters to hold our elected officials accountable. If they lie to us, then we should vote them out of office. If they undermine the rule of law, we shouldn't give them a reward. But we've seen in recent weeks that undermining the rule of law and trying to overturn the election, if I were a voter in Pennsylvania and the president says, we're going to ignore your election, I'd be upset about that. But there are many people, and too many people in my view, who see that as actually something worth championing. And this is where the law, a constitution can't save us from ourselves. And this, I think, a question is like when you're with your children and they say, why? And they say, why? And you answer the question, they say, why? Well, there's no answer. You can go back to the first principles, because the universe was created by dust. Why? I mean, this is what's happening with our government. You can push every single lever, and at some point it will break. And that is the deep concern for those of us watching the Constitution slowly be eroded, over these last several weeks. And this is why, ultimately, going back to the 2016 election, when Trump was asked, would you accept defeat in the election? And he refused to acknowledge he might concede. There were gasps. And it wasn't because he wasn't being polite. or being a gentleman or a statesman. It was because this is the fundamental thing that makes our country strong and that makes democracy work. People who lose walk away because they believe in democracy more than they believe in their party.
Right.
That seems to be on the table right now, and that's frightening.
Right. But even as you were just discussing it, so my point is that the defeat of our democracy would be using the mechanics of our own laws, using that law about what can happen on January 16th and using it, implementing it by someone like a Trump-like figure is distorting it, but still using the mechanics of the law. So can the law be changed to have more safeguards? That, I guess that's the question I have. Do we need more safeguards? And I guess the auxiliary question with that is, do you think up to now that our courts have held that the constitutional system seems strong enough to withstand somebody like a Trump?
Yes, I do. I've been very proud of judges and lawyers by and large. There's been lots of irresponsible behavior and irresponsible rhetoric from many quarters of the country. I was very bullish on the courts and the lawyers as the Trump campaign started ramping up its litigation, because unlike politicians and unlike regular party leaders, lawyers are trained to believe in the rule of law and to defend the rule of law, and they have. In fact, one of the reasons Trump has been so unsuccessful in this litigation is because skilled lawyers have refused to participate in his shenanigans. Judges require evidence to be shown, and evidence hasn't been provided, and lawyers have stayed out of it. The one large disappointment to that is the lawsuit that was raised by the Attorney General in Texas that was joined by 17 other attorneys general in the United States. That was really disappointing for our legal profession, because those individuals weren't elected to be the mouthpiece of whatever their public may see rightly or wrongly.
Right.
They were elected to enforce the law, and 17 of them signed a brief that said, we want to undermine the law. And that was a real disappointment. But besides that, lawyers have stood strong and the courts have stood strong, and they've held the parties accountable. But you are right, Sheila. The laws themselves can be used to change our government in very fundamental ways. I think that people would be upset if state legislatures started to award electoral college votes not based on elections. That would still be legal, but that would feel undemocratic. And hopefully the people won't allow that to happen. If state legislatures try to do that, we'll elect new members to our legislatures to change that law.
Okay. So that takes care of talking about January 6th. Let's talk about, since you're an expert on voting and voter suppression, I just want a brief overview. The beginning of our country, only propertied men could vote. Can you give us just a little overview of how we've come to expand voting rights and what the challenges still are today?
Yeah, the founding, only men who were white, who owned property, who were citizens, who were adults could vote. And those qualifications have slowly dropped off one by one for various reasons. Some of it has to do with wartime. Sometimes, we saw people who didn't own property serving the Revolutionary War, and we thought, well, how could that happen? Even as recently as the Vietnam War, how can we have our young 18-year-olds go fight for this country but not have a say in the wars that we're fighting in? And that led to the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age. There's also been strong mobilization around African-American voting rights and female voting rights in the Constitution. But ultimately, even with constitutional protections that would grant, for example, the 15th Amendment says you can't discriminate in voting based on race. Because of the Hayes-Tilden election and for other reasons, in the South, there was Jim Crow discrimination. It was this systemic government-sponsored discrimination where people couldn't register to vote. They couldn't vote if they were African-American or other racial minority. And in 1960s, the Congress passed in 1965 the Voting Rights Act that essentially restated what the 15th Amendment said, but also provided some very real steps for people to enforce that with clear standards for courts to follow. And that really is chipped away to the extent now that there's a guarantee of equal political opportunity for all people, regardless of their skin color, their ethnicity, under the law. We still struggle with that. And the reason we struggle with that is because this is one of the challenges that lawyers face relative to people who are elected to office. Lawyers take cases after something bad has happened. They don't get to decide that there's going to be a problem and change it like a legislator does. They have a client who's been injured, and then they go to court to vindicate that client's rights. What that means is you have, let's say, an African American or an African American community somewhere in Connecticut whose voting rights have been minimized in some way. So you file a lawsuit and the court says, oh my gosh, you have been discriminated against. And so they tell the city, stop having an election rule that discriminates. And the city says, okay, we won't do that thing anymore. And they just come up with a different rule. And then you wait for your client to be injured. And then the city loses its election. And they say, okay, we won't do that anymore. And they come up with another rule. So their first rule might be, you can't register to vote unless your grandparents were able to vote. The so-called grandfather clauses of the early or the late 1800s. Okay, well, that was illegal. Well, so what are we going to do now? Well, we'll require you to be able to read. We'll have a literacy test. Well, we showed that those were racist in nature. So what do we do now? Well, now we're going to require you to show an ID. And those have shown around the country to have racist impacts. So now what are we going to do? And so the difficulty in actually overcoming this problem is that legally we're only able to enforce the law after the fact. And we're in this cat and mouse game where states can change their rules. And each time they change it, an election happens that suppresses the vote. And then after we vindicate that right, suppression can happen in a different form going forward. But I want to be clear, the suppression that was happening in the 60s and prior to the 1960s, which was eliminating basically an entire class of people, all African Americans, that's not what's happening now. The suppression we see now is on the margins in most cases. Even voter ID laws may deter 1% to 2% of minority vote turnout.
Yeah.
And so we're in a much better place, but we still have a ways to go.
Yeah, so the kinds of things that they're doing now, and I guess it's political, it's not necessarily racist, it's political. It's you don't want the other side to be able to vote. So it's things like cutting out the ballot boxes in the various areas so you can't drop your ballots off, or it's cutting the hours for early voting, or it's cutting the number of polling places in half so that there are longer lines and people get discouraged. Things of that nature, and they're doing that in many states, and some of them are being okayed by the courts because the explain how the Voting Rights Act was one part of it was essentially revoked and said with the court saying, well, we don't really have racism in our elections anymore, so we don't need that pre-clearance. Explain that and why that was a wrong decision in your opinion.
Well, so this game of cat and mouse that I was just deciding was really pervasive in the South. And so when the Voting Rights Act was passed, Congress recognized that just providing a cause of action, meaning just providing a legal case and relief for voter suppression, wasn't going to be enough in Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama. And so what Congress decided was that in certain parts of the country, particularly where there had been this game where states were losing cases under the Constitution, but then finding new ways to discriminate, they would create a system where those states had to get pre-clearance. They had to get permission anytime they changed their election rules. And they had to get permission from the federal government to assure that they weren't changing their rules just to perpetuate more suppression. And that existed for 40 years. And in Shelby County versus Holder, a 2013 Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court said, well, we don't really see big differences now in voter turnout between white and black communities in the South. Things have changed. There's not as much racism going on anymore. We're going to eliminate this need for pre-clearance. And Justice Ginsburg in her dissent made a very apt, I think, metaphor. She said, you're telling me that the law is working, therefore we don't need it. That's like telling me that because you're holding an umbrella in a rainstorm and you're dry, you don't need to have your umbrella anymore. Right. But she was in the dissent. And so that pre-clearance regime disappeared. And we've seen across the South, again, a resurgence of suppression tactics. And one more word about this. I think it's ridiculous. It's not just ridiculous on matters of race and the law. It's ridiculous as a matter of politics. Republicans think, and they're beginning to say this out loud, the only way we can win elections is if we suppress the vote. Donald Trump said, look, they want enough people to vote that you'd never be able to elect Republicans again. I find it odd because on the one hand, that's an explicit acknowledgement that the people you've been able to exclude from our civil society are people who are Democrats, ostensibly. You think that's who they're going to vote for. So you're acknowledging you've done a good job keeping them out of the system. But it's actually empirically not true. We just had an election where voter turnout in every state hit a 100-year record, and Republicans won across the board. They increased their seats in the House. They held their seats in the Senate. They won state legislatures across the country. Donald Trump didn't win, but he's an interesting side case. Republicans don't even like him. Republicans won even when turnout was at a 100-year high. So this idea that Republicans can't win with high turnout is false. And I hope they would recognize that and say, maybe we need to expand the franchise so we can keep winning. But so far, it doesn't look like that.
Right. Well, I love that comment from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because it was that comment that caused, I think, a law student to coin the term the notorious RBG after she read that decision. That was terrific. There's gerrymandering also is another way to cut down on representation. Just give us a little explanation of that, how there's less representation because the districts are gerrymandered by the political party in power.
Yeah, gerrymandering is a very, very difficult issue to kind of wrap our head around, because there's not really a right way to draw districts. We can think about wrong ways to draw districts, but it's just a system involving trade-offs. The challenge is the people who are drawing the lines are the members of the state legislatures who will benefit from those lines. So that's really the thing that bothers me, is that we don't have neutral parties drawing those lines. We have people who are going to benefit from those lines drawing them. And there's not an equal playing field for winners and losers usually. Connecticut's actually unique on that front. But what ultimately happens is you find where all of the people who you don't want to vote for you live, and you pack them all together into one district. And then you get 6 remaining districts to vote for yourself. And that creates huge disparities. North Carolina is an extreme example. Democrats are voting for Democratic candidates in state house in North Carolina at 50%. In one election was 48%, and in one election was 51%. But Democrats only have 3 seats out of 13 in the state Senate. Why? Well, the reason is because Republicans got to draw the lines. So they put all the Democrats into 3 districts, and then the 45% of Republicans get to be in 10 districts. And so it skews electoral power away from what looks like proportional representation, which is the theory that Democratic, kind of representative government works on. If you have 80% of the population, you should have about 80% of the seats in the legislature, and gerrymandering skews that away from that proportional representation.
Right. And didn't the Supreme Court refuse to even take on that issue, claiming it was a political issue they didn't want to get involved in?
Yeah, in 2019, the Supreme Court heard this case out of North Carolina challenging that exact set of districts. And they said, this actually looks like it violates the Constitution, but it's not the kind of issue that courts are well equipped to deal with. Some issues should be relegated to the political realm. That's disappointing, because the political realm's broken. That's the whole point. How are Democrats in North Carolina supposed to vindicate their rights? They have a majority of the population, but they only have 3 representatives. So how are those 3 representatives going to convince the 10 other representatives to vindicate their rights? That's the reason I think it was disappointing. Not that the court wants to avoid political questions, but on this specific issue, the politics themselves are broken. So to say, go and ask your legislator to fix it is a hollow remedy.
Yeah. Now, some states, I don't know how many, are having independent commissions to do the redistricting. Is that so?
So yeah, a handful of states have enacted rules that would allow an independent redistricting commission, which actually seems, at least structurally, to be an improvement over legislators. But there's a concern that the Supreme Court will strike down those independent redistricting commissions in the wake of this 2020 election. As it turns out, everything comes full circle. One of the arguments that the Trump campaign made out of Pennsylvania was they wanted to discard a whole bunch of absentee ballots. Why? Well, because the deadline for accepting absentee ballots was extended by the state Supreme Court. And the Trump campaign argued the state Supreme Court should have no say over how votes are tallied. The legislature gets to decide. This goes back to our talk about the Electoral College. The legislature has full authority to make these decisions. And the Supreme Court is sitting on that request. And I think they're likely to hear that case next spring. And some of us believe that the court will take that case and they'll say, you know what? The state legislatures are the only body that gets to make these decisions. Right. Yeah. And so independent commissions can't make decisions about how lines are drawn and how people are elected. Only the legislature can. So this case that started as an absentee ballot case could turn out to invalidate independent redistricting commissions next year. So that's something to keep our eyes on.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. I have another question now. We're getting toward the end of our discussion, but I can't let end without asking you this. President Trump is about to go on a pardon spree, or so it's advertised in the news. Can a president pardon himself? And can a president pardon people preemptively, the way that Nixon was pardoned? He had not been indicted for anything. Can you get a pardon for any crimes you may have committed in the past or you may commit in the future? Talk about that.
This is a completely open question. We have some examples in the past where, for example, Ford pardoned Nixon before he was indicted. George Washington pardoned people who had been involved in the rebellion before there were any legal actions. There was a blanket pardon of people who had refused to serve in Vietnam. So there before they were prosecuted. And so I don't know the answer, because the ultimate answer is whatever the 9 Supreme Court justices decide their interpretation of the pardon clause is. But there are a few dimensions to keep in mind. First, the pardon power of the president is limited to federal crimes. So whatever the president decides to do, whoever he decides to pardon, does not extend to any crime that's committed under state law. And most of the rules that people break are actually state crimes. The only federal crimes you can break are if you discriminate against people, if you use drugs, or if you commit a crime like at a state border and carry the body across the border or something. So actually the pardons wouldn't be as far-reaching as many people think. That's the first thing to keep in mind. And secondly, a lot of this is actually procedural. It's not really whether or not the pardon can happen. It's what does the prosecutor do after somebody's been pardoned preemptively. In the case of President Nixon, a prosecutor still could have brought a case and said, well, you were pardoned, but that doesn't exist. What ultimately happened is prosecutors used their discretion to say, we don't want to take our resources on the off chance that the court does decide that you can pardon someone preemptively. It doesn't seem like you can, because the court has held to accept a pardon is to accept that you're guilty and that you can reject a pardon. And so there has to be some element of guilt, and something has had to have happened. So it seems that even though it's an open question, that it leans towards not the ability not to preempt pardon. But the only way we'd ever get a case before the courts is if a prosecutor decided to go after somebody who's been pardoned anyway. And it's not clear to me prosecutors who have limited resources will decide that that's the battle that they want to fight. So we'll have to see what happens in the courts, but we'll also have to see just practically, will people try to bring lawsuits against the Trumps or Giuliani or whoever Trump decides to provide a blanket pardon for? But again, it would only apply to a very small subset of potential violations.
And can he pardon himself? Can he grant, the word grant pardon, can you grant something to yourself?
Well, I don't think so. My reading of the understanding of the word grant and the way that the pardon power developed in the original Constitution is something that you had to give to somebody else. It was a gift, and that the word grant was not self-referential, either it was used at the time or even its intent based on the power that they were borrowing from the king in England. That's my understanding. But if the justices decide that they want to open up the Oxford Dictionary from 2018 and look at the word grant and decide that grant is self-referential and you can give yourself something, I can grant myself wishes or something. Really this is one of those questions, not a lot of questions actually are as open as this. This is a question where really all we can say is, what do we think the 9 people sitting on the Supreme Court will say? The 9 justices are a majority right now, conservatives, who say they believe in the original meaning of words. So if they look back at the meaning of the word grant in the 1700s, they will not allow Trump to pardon himself. But I'll also acknowledge that many people who claim to be originalists sometimes will abandon their original position if it will benefit the party that they belong to. And so that's the concern, that the court might just have a political say on this and allow it. And there's really no way to know with certainty in advance. If I had to put my money on something, I would say that the courts will not allow a self-referential grant or a preemptive pardon. But I don't have a lot of money to put on it.
I'll vote with you. I don't know. We'll see. All right. So my final thoughts are, under Trump, he's trampled norms, not understood or followed constitutional norms and requirements and so on. I think of Nixon, who was a crook, who resigned, but even he knew that he gave a semi-gracious speech saying goodbye. He waved, he went to the helicopter, he followed a protocol of majesty of some sort when that happened. Trump will not do that. And my question is, will we ever get back to those norms, those protocols, that faith in the way things are supposed to work? Or has Trump kind of spoiled that for us? Or is he an aberration and we can get back to, quote, normal?
Sir, I certainly think Trump's an aberration in a few respects. I'm not a psychologist, and I can't diagnose him with anything, but even he's admitted at his rallies, it's really hard for me to lose. I just can't do it. I just can't be gracious. And he says this about himself. So there's just something about him as a person that just doesn't allow him to be gracious in defeat, whether it means he lies or stomps his feet or whatever, even as a grown adult. And so I think that is not the way that most humans are constituted. But I also think the thing that makes Trump an aberration is he has no history of public service ever. He never served on a school board. He never volunteered for his PTA. He never was a governor. And people who go through this process of working in public service, they learn to be acculturated in these ideals and these norms of the way that our democracy works. The senators who run the Republican Party have not shown the kind of backbone that we would hope to say this is the way that you go about conceding an election. Watch Al Gore's concession speech in 2000. Watch Nixon's speech in 1972. Look at the way that you can go about doing this with saving face for our party. But those are the norms that you develop by being in public service. And we usually prefer candidates who have that kind of experience, not just because it helps them develop, but we understand that if you've been through an election at a city level and a state level and a national level before, we know that there's no skeletons in your closet. We know that we can trust that millions of people have already looked at your record and found and vetted you to decide that you're a good enough candidate before you're raised up to the ultimate say. Remember, one of the concerns about President Obama, he didn't have any electoral experience on the national stage. I don't know that we'll find people who are so outsider and foreign to this entire process becoming president immediately with no other chance for us to learn about their character in the public sphere, where we have transparency about their finances and about their behavior. So to that extent, I think Trump's an aberration because he came to us as a complete unknown. And we've learned a lot about him. And when we learned about that, we voted him out of office.
Okay.
So going forward, I do think that the people running for president will have that background. And as a result, we haven't lost everything.
But just on a thought, Professor, isn't that somewhat of a commentary on our electors, on our population who were hoodwinked or propagandized by Trump, he didn't have any experience, but he was a famous reality celebrity television star. And what does that say about the quality of our education and our civic understanding of the kind of people we need to vote for? Is that a commentary on our lack of civic understanding and our voters?
Well, it certainly is a commentary on our society values and the rise of reality TV and scripted realities and people becoming famous for being not good, but writing that fame into things that they like, that people actually try to violate the rules in order to gain some notoriety. That's part of it. I mean, our culture in our society is developing around growing up and wanting to be famous just for the sake of being famous. But I also think it's worth remembering, as strong of a record and as strong of a character and a person as Hillary Clinton was and brought to the table as a candidate, as a former Secretary of State and a former senator, people did not like her. I grew up in a family, as I mentioned before, my father's a staunch conservative, and my earliest political memories were the Clinton impeachment. One of my earliest memories was the Clinton impeachment. And harboring resentment against Hillary Clinton that I think explains whether it's Hillary Clinton specifically as a person or whether it was sexism. I think that explains the 2016 result as much as our cultural love for reality TV. And that idea is confirmed to me by the 2020 race, where Republican Party just dominated the election. They won every close race that there was, and yet Donald Trump lost. And so he wasn't a product of some changing Republican Party. I think he was a product of being lucky, running in a primary with 20 other people who weeded out. I think somewhat he appealed to people's nativist and kind of racist base. And I think Hillary Clinton contributed to that as well. And so I don't think that he represents something that will be the new norm going forward for the next 10 or 20 years. Many people disagree with me. I don't doubt that. They think that this is really Trump as a symptom more than a cause. But I do think he's an aberration, and I do think we can get ourselves back to being more of a normal politics going forward.
Okay, great. Well, this has been terrific, Professor. You've taught me and our viewers so many things. I'd love to have you back again. Let's see if things go smoothly up until January 20th, and I'll check in with you after that. For everyone listening, I want to thank Professor Doug Spencer, and we'll see him again, and we'll see you next time on Talkback. Bye. Bye, Professor. Great to see you.
You too.